Hello, friends and readers. This week we are going to be looking at the story Victor Ochoa's New Idea. This follows along with the theme that we were going through last week, where we were looking at text features and text structures of stories. We want to be able to look at the events that happen and how they affect what is going on. So we talked about sequencing a story, cause and event, cause and effect, and now we're going to kind of look at those same things with this story. So the thing that we have in common is this story goes along with inventing. So last week we read about Mary Anderson, and this week we are going to read about Victor Ochoa. But before we get into that, reading about time and sequence. When we read about a story that's told in a specific time order, it is sequential. Using time and sequence words will help you understand how events in history are connected. Do you like a good story? Then you probably enjoy history. History is the story of events that happen in the past. Historical events are usually told in a sequence, which is the order in which they happen. The sequence can help you understand the relationship or connections between those events. When you read, look for signal words that give clues about time, order, and sequence. Our signal words include first, next, and finally, are just some of them. You might also see things like later that year or a specific date, like here it's 1964. So that time frame or the date gives you an idea of when in history this might have happened. So we want to think about our events and how one thing leads to another. So when we were doing literature, we talked about beginning, middle, and end. Now we're talking about a series of real events that happened. So this is a cartoon to kind of help you get the idea of a historical event. First, the Vikings sailed to North America. Next, they started a settlement. After a few difficult years, the Vikings gave up and returned home. So here we can see our first, next, after. We see that they have to arrive before they can start to settle down. Why did they leave? Because it was difficult. So they came and went, and it had to happen in this order, right? They had to arrive in their new settlement before they could start to build. So when we talk about sequence of events, we are talking about the events that are important that happen in a story. So this is the chronological order or sequence of this story. The Vikings sailed to America, they began to build, they returned home. If you started off by saying they returned home, you would be wondering, where did they return home from? So we always tell a story in order in which it happened. So when we look at Victor Ochoa, we have some very important events that happen. You should have already read this story and be familiar with it. When we look at it, we want to pull out events that are also important to what's going on. So when we read this story, we know that Victor Ochoa was someone who invented things. How did he start to invent things? He was inspired to do so, and it's really all about how he was an inventor and how he wanted to make life easier. So when we look at this, we see a date, and we know that Victor was born in Mexico. He loved to work with writers. Because of that, he began to write newspapers and open newspapers. Then, in 1908, he thought of an idea. And this idea was to make a plane fly like a bird. So, first he was a writer, then he was a builder, and we can see these sequence of events happening. If this story was about how he grew up, we might focus on the fact that it was in Mexico and then he lived in Texas. But this story more focuses on him going from one career path to another. So we put these two events as the most important. In 1805, Victor was born and he loved working with writers and he started a newspaper. Then he decided he wanted to fly a plane like a bird. As we continue to read, we see some more key details that were important. This plane was different because it could fold its wings up. So not only was he inventing an airplane that was different. Because he had this idea, he then started a company to make his planes. He worked for 20 years and no one really knows if his plane ever flew, but this is what he was working up to for that whole 20 years and the series of events that was happening. Now, after the airplane, he still had new ideas that he decided to invest his time in, and he created more things. He was always making new things, and that is important and essential to this story. So in 1850, Victor was born and he loved writing and started newspapers. Then in 1908, Victor wanted a plane to fly like a bird. So Victor started to create his new plane. His plane was different, and that's what's important, because its wings could fold so the plane could be stored. Then Victor started a company for his planes. He worked for 20 years, but no one knows if it ever flew. But that didn't stop Victor. He continued to create new things based on the ideas he had. So a series of events takes the idea of what is important and then goes from there. When we look at this, at some point we are going to be talking about, well, what is the main idea of this story? And when you sequence a text first, trying to find that main idea is a lot easier because you're looking at the events that are very important and what do they have in common. So sequencing a text is also something that lends to your other thought processes and your other ways of thinking about a story. So reread Victor Ochoa, dive in and enjoy.